Hello everyone! You might have noticed, it's been a hot minute since you last heard from me. Around a month longer than I'd have liked. But I promise I wasn't just playing Baldur's Gate 3 the entire time. Instead, I've been working away at Project Concordia fairly consistently, and made some pretty big improvements in the overall look and feel of the game. Now, when I say big, I'm talking night and day. I initially wanted to make a more casual devlog, something less structured than usual, but there's so much to cover I wouldn't know how to explain it all without some kind of script. The direct consequence of this is that I didn't really record any progress, so instead of a step-by-step improvement, I'm just going to show you the end product and dissect every addition I made. Yep, like I said, pretty substantial improvement. The last thing I'd shown in a devlog was the custom level editor, which turned out pretty well by the end, but when it came to running the game, it kinda just looked like trash. The overabundance of prototype assets, lack of personality, and just complete absence of any juice just left everything feeling very flat, unimpactful, and frankly quite boring. So I set out to work on improving this, mainly through art improvements, but one thing you'd learn quickly about me is that while art, both game and otherwise, is an interest of mine, I lack the motivation and drive to sit down and actually do it. This unfortunately manifests in slower development time, which is the real reason it took 2 months to get here, but I think it was worth the time and effort. If I can give one piece of advice for any aspiring game developers out there, the main name of the game is variety. They say it's the spice of life, and when you're trapped in a hole of endless drawing programs and artboards, taking a step back and changing the pace is a really good way of reigniting motivation for something. In this case, I jumped around a lot between code editions and art editions. Last thing to cover before we get into the specifics of what I've added, we need to discuss the inspiration and target aesthetic I'm aiming for when developing the art for this game, even if the art is more advanced prototype art. The goal is to simulate the vague appearance of the final product, regardless if I do decide to pursue this project to its end, and if I don't, it'd be worth the effort to have a presentable demo to release. Hypotheticals aside, there was one thing I knew for certain: I don't want to do pixel art. Not because I don't like pixel art, quite the contrary really. Ignoring the fact I've avoided pixel art in my last game, Dial-In, I did so for a similar reason I'm avoiding it with this game, and that's that it's too typical. That might sound a little reductive or needless, but when it comes to carving out a niche in indie development, you need to stand out in a crowd of similar products. And when it comes to a top-down action shooter, there is one game I will undoubtedly be compared to the point where even I'm comparing my own game to it. Hotline Miami is such a monolithic entity in the genre that even things inspired from other games in the genre are still associated to Hotline Miami. That being said, I've shot myself in the foot here because my target setting is inspired by cyberpunk, which itself is rooted in a lot of aesthetics from the 80s when it was written. That will inevitably be another point Project Concordia is compared by, which I recognize, so my goal is to gain points in style from other facets of the game. My key inspiration is something aesthetic adjacent, drawing stylizations from cyberpunk anime through the 80s and 90s. A good example of this would be Ghost in the Shell, which released in 1995. There's something really evocative of this style that causes people to be nostalgic for an era of media they sometimes didn't even experience when it was relevant. This particular target aesthetic was actually suggested to me, and I like the idea enough to focus on it. There are a lot of subtleties to this style, and thankfully I don't need to worry about the actual art style itself until I'm doing things like drawing character portraits and whatnot. But there are several key things I'd like to point out as a sort of artistic target when developing art from here on out. First of all, as is in almost all anime, both old and new, there is a distinction between animated elements and the background. Animated elements are mostly cel-shaded and distinct elements from the background, which tends to be painted and completely static. These painterly backgrounds tend to be more detailed and somewhat lineless. Secondly, the line art on these older productions is hand-drawn, and often made for smaller resolutions, so the line art on these characters tends to be somewhat fuzzy and almost has a glow to it. This will be harder to notice on smaller characters in a game, but worth including regardless. Finally, there's a very warm tone to this era of anime. Even in cooler settings with harsh blues and greys, a warm tone seems to overlay everything. These are going to be the three main things I consider when developing the art, but if there's any more aspects I've missed or hadn't considered, I'd love to hear any ideas you all have in the comments. So, now that we have a style in mind, let's get started with a really simple addition. For the keen-eyed who caught it at the end of the last devlog, the first thing I added was programming in some variance in the way equipables are displayed in-game. Weapons lying on the floor now hover to indicate their interactability, and they spawn in various rotations to prevent a degree of monotony. I took direct inspiration here from Hotline Miami, and made it so that when weapons are thrown, they spin in midair rather than flying in a static rotation. I think in a game where there's only one object in the environment you can interact with, it should be pretty clear. Heat Signature, the other game we've been looking at for reference, doesn't have any indicator of what is and isn't interactable in the environment. Likely because having these floating weapons makes the game a bit more arcadey, but instead it lets you see all the available weapons in the stage by listing them in the pause view and letting you warp them to you rather than having to stand next to them to equip, in a sense making the game more tactical rather than purely action-based. Code Edition number 1, complete. Alright, next up, let's lay down some foundations to open our options for visual effects and post-processing. A quick download of the URP and our project is now running on a different render pipeline. This render pipeline comes with one pretty big addition, which is clear as day, and that's 2D lighting. Out of every addition I've made to this project, lighting has to be the single most impactful. It adds a level of depth to the flat scenes that is really difficult to capture otherwise, and lets us do some really interesting stuff with colored lighting and dynamically moving objects. Here you can see things like doors affecting the casted shadows and making it more obvious when a door has opened or closed. These lights don't come for free though. You have to set up each light individually, so I had to include an entirely new tab in the level editor that gave access to tools for including lights, removing them, saving them, and then loading them into the game. These lights are just point lights for now. Unity's 2D light package is decent, but not overly in depth, so there is no real reason to add any finer controls, but their colors can be modified and these settings can be loaded between lights. Adding these lights didn't involve creating any specific art assets, so this is another code addition. Let's take this opportunity to shift our focus to the characters. Without any proper character art, we're just going to be stuck with blue dude versus grey dudes, which sucks. So I went ahead and used the existing skeleton as a reference to create sprites for our simple grunt. These dudes are bald, wear brown shirts, shoulder pads, and that's about it. You can see they've got simple flat colors with thin line art and some vague top-down shading. Most of their shading ends up being negligible due to the lighting, but because of the 2D lighting engine's ability to use normal maps, it's possible in the future we can incorporate the shadows into the dynamic lighting itself. This also ended up being where I found out the skeleton system I implemented in the past just wasn't going to work as expected. Instead, I scrapped it and vouched for a similar pivot-based animation system, which functions almost identically, but a generic rig can actually be used by multiple characters and sprites rather than needing a different rig per character. This meant I had to redo all the poses as well, but this didn't take that long, and mainly amounted to reposing the character over the old poses. These grunts are completely blank slates, and aren't likely to make it into the final version of the game, but they make good stand-ins in the meantime. Our player character, on the other hand, is a different story. Since it's a cyberpunk setting, it'd be foolish to not have our player character be filled with cybernetics. In this case, it's serving both a narrative and a gameplay purpose, as the energy meter is tied to the story of their augments. I drew them wearing a simple black coat that's been burnt on one side, revealing their cybernetic arm. Their head is also heavily augmented, basically hiding any shred of their humanity, while their back is fitted with 3 large hunks of metal, which I imagine function as some sort of souped up power source. Also worth noting, I redid the leg animation, and applied it to both characters. It's basically a more detailed sprite animation for running that has more frames for a more fluid run cycle. Getting these characters drawn was practically the most daunting task for me, and I effectively did each with a huge pause between, so I'm going to count these two as 2 points for the art additions. I think it's about time we focus a bit on the environment now. Unfortunately, I didn't end up implementing any props outside of those you're already familiar with, basically just the automatic doors, the glass panels, and the equipables, but the environment as a whole has gotten a pretty significant facelift. For starters, I went ahead and scrapped all those prototype tiles I showed off in the level editor video. Basically, none of them were fit to use. The carpet tiled weirdly, the big tiles looked boring, the small tiles were too visually dense, and the wooden panels made no narrative sense. Really, Why would they have wooden panels in space? At best, it's imitation wood, and at worst, that's probably the most expensive floor in the entirety of Concord City. So, I focused on creating new tiles that had some degree of variation, as well as some dynamic rule sets to make for more interesting layouts. For now, I ended up with 6 types of tiles to work with. I have some fairly generic flat color tiles, coming in dark, light, grey and navy, sticking to the grittier colors and themes of the genre, and then made a variant of both the dark and light tiles, which have a border. This border goes further into the tile than I would have initially liked, but due to the offset of the wall tiles being centered between tiles rather than on tiles, I had to adjust the border several times so it would be visible if a room's floor was solely border tiles. Once I had the assets drawn up, I used Unity's rule tiles to create a system that detects the neighboring tiles and changes its sprite accordingly. I ended up using this exact layout for pretty much all my rule tiles going forwards, as you'll see, but due to the unfortunate bleed that occurs on sprites in Unity that have any form of compression filter, I had to include a bit of bleed on the edges of each tile sprite rather than having them all directly connected. Once I had some basic tiles in place, I wanted to put some more textured tiles in. For this, I went with a concrete tile, which basically uses dense noise maps and random cloud textures with a lot of editing to get this harsh white on grey mottled effect. For good measure, I included a bunch of variants of the tile with different arrangements of the texture inside it in an attempt to prevent obvious tiling. But to make sure each tile still matched with the next, I kept the borders of each tile the same. This meant that there is still some degree of tiling, but it's not as bad as it could have been, I think. Using a similar process, I made a carpet tile, since I could feasibly imagine some kind of synth thread carpets existing in more lavish accommodations in a sci-fi setting. This has a similar generation method as the concrete, where most of it is randomly generated noise and clouds, which went through a bunch of editing to get to where we are here. The difference is carpets have a border, following a similar layout to the border tiles I showed just before. This matters more here because to get the border working without using an ungodly amount of tiles for every scenario, each tile needs to correctly match borders with the next tile in any rotation. I ended up finding a trick for this where I essentially duplicated the tile I had 3 more times, rotated each duplicate by 90 to 270 degrees, and then turned them into multiply layers, effectively creating a tile that seamlessly connects at all rotations. The last 2 tiles I'll cover are a bit more industrial. I basically just drew what I could see on reference images and made a sheet metal tile and a metal grate tile, both of which I'm not too happy with. I think the metal grate is way too visually dense and the sheet metal doesn't make a whole lot of sense as a floor, but we got them, so we might as well chuck them in since they're at least presentable at a bare minimum. Much like getting the characters done, this took a while and went over multiple days where I jump on and off this particular task, but I'm only going to give it 1 point towards the art counter. Before we move on to the wall tiles, we need to talk about what's going on with the tile maps as a whole. You might have noticed that when I showed the plain tiles, there was a lot of texture in them that wasn't visible on the tiles themselves, and also expands further than a tile should. Well, one of the targets of our aesthetic is to nail that feeling of a painterly background. Now, I'm not going to hand paint these tiles or anything like that, that just isn't the focus of the game. But what I can do is create a watercolor style overlay that breaks up tiling and makes the background stand apart from the flat colored sprites. I ended up finding a free licensed watercolor image, which I turned into a tiling sprite with a bit of editing. As mentioned before, to get the overlay working, I had to make my own custom shader. I'm pretty unfamiliar with programming shaders, and my only experience in the past has been setting up the static shader in Dialin, so I opted to use ShaderGraph, knowing it has some performance issues that are worth keeping in mind, and in future I might try rebuilding these shaders in code. This took a bit more effort than I anticipated, and while I don't like showing my code in these devlogs for fear of scrutiny, I think it's okay to show any shaders I create to see if any of you guys watching have any advice on how I could improve them. The main issue I encountered was just with getting the texture to tile correctly, as well as getting the texture to tile over world space rather than centering on each tile of the tile map, since Unity considers them all individual sprites rather than one big sprite. Obviously, you can see I got it working here, and despite the time it took finding references for watercolor and trying to create my own textures from scratch, I think I'll count this as another code addition, since the shader was the most interesting part of it for me. Okay, let's take a look at the walls now, shall we? I only made 4 kinds of walls, because for the most part, fairly neutral walls go a pretty long way in completely top-down games. On top of that, once I added lighting, I realized that pretty much all the detail of the wall tiles gets erased since the walls themselves are casting shadows. This led to me making the walls significantly lighter than I originally intended, so they'd still be somewhat visible in the darkness of the walls if the player paid attention. All 4 wall tiles are rule tiles that follow this template. Because the wall tiles are strictly locked to a grid of multiples of 4 in the map editor, certain arrangements of wall tiles are simply impossible without external additions. I don't think there's much to comment about these wall tiles. They're fairly simple flat colours with a noise filter and some small degree of shadow that's meant to simulate the light fading as it reaches the top, but most of this detail is lost in practice. We have a very basic interior white wall, which would work for most environments, and a black wall, which is intended for connecting different wall types, or for an alternative to the white wall in basic interiors. The other 2 walls are more in theme with that industrial vibe I mentioned earlier with the sheet metal floor tiles. These 2 being a crossbar wall tile, which I personally quite like the look of in a lot of environments, and the hazard wall tile, which turned out the best in my opinion and actually reads quite well despite how dark it gets in the shadows. Since it's an adjacent topic, I ended up redoing the automatic door sprites and the glass panels to add a bit more depth, as well as creating an alternative glass panel that can't be walked through once shattered. This means it can be shot through, seen through, but not traversed, leading to a slightly different interaction than a typical glass panel. These wall tiles were actually a lot more fun to make than the floor tiles, and the door and glass sprites were sort of trivial, so I'll only count this as one art addition. I'd like to move back to a code addition, but I've actually got a couple more art additions for you first, mainly adding body segments to create corpses. Long gone are the days of dumping out a grayed out faceless corpse. I took a slightly different route to get this working, having the enemy animator pose them in a downed position, and update their torso, head, and hand sprites accordingly. Once their body settles, they either remain in that position lying on the floor or sitting against the wall and recover, or if the damage was lethal, they'll spawn a corpse object in their resting position. This object gets handed all the sprite parts from the enemy and uses those to update itself to use the same sprites and position, just with a completely stripped down script to prevent them from making pointless update calls. Once a corpse object spawns, it starts to pool blood, which helps massively in making a distinction between downed enemies and corpses. Creating these sprites was slightly easier than making the top-down sprites in the first place, since a lot of how I drew these could be based off them. But I do have to give credit where credit is due, since I ended up heavily basing these sprites off the down sprites in Heat Signature. I think I'll likely return back to these down sprites in the future. Currently there's no clear damage on the character sprites themselves, apart from the blood beneath them when they've taken lethal damage for one, and I'd like there to be more poses rather than one for lying down and one for against the wall. For now, that'll just be one more point for art additions. Almost done now. I've got a pretty good idea of how long this devlog's gotten, so I won't linger too long on the last few. Do you remember what happens when glass shatters? A couple glass shards get knocked out and sit on the floor. These glass shards are based on a parent class called a traveling object, and I went ahead and added a bunch of additions to the code of these objects for multiple use cases, which I'm sure you've already seen in action throughout this devlog. With the glass panels, glass shards themselves spawn with random sprites, a random rotation between a preset minimum and maximum, as well as a random scale between a preset min and max. Bullet casings also fly out of guns now, using similar random rotations as well as random speeds, so they don't all land in the same spot. They also spawn at a higher sorting order and then land at a lower sorting order, to sort of simulate gravity to an extent. Finally, the landing sprite of the object can change, which is used in the case of the blood spray whenever an enemy is hit with lethal damage. These globs of blood shoot out and then become randomly scaled, randomly selected splatters of blood on the floor. +1 for code additions. With the casings, I'm sure you noticed new sprites for the bullets, especially since different gun types shoot different bullets. And more importantly, the guns themselves got a fresh coat of paint. No more scrawled pixel pistols and random baseball bats. How would they even play recreational baseball in a space station? Anyway, each gun has its own respective held sprite that appears when in a character's hands. I got a tiny bit lazy, and the energy weapons are just light-coloured versions of the standard guns. These guns are also not super lore friendly, since I mainly just based them on references I found, so these are technically temporary, But regardless, important to include since all these elements come together to make the game look good. Alongside these sprites, I also added super simple animations when attacking. These animations are very rough, but they're the first signifier of when the player is actually attacking while holding a melee weapon. Let's finish this off with a code addition. This was technically the first thing I added, but I've left it till last because it actually makes zero sense to have done this first. This addition is post-processing, which I've used in several ways to enhance the overall juice of the game. If juice is a term you're not familiar with, it's not super easy to define, but I'll link below a really good talk on the topic. The video is at least 10 years old now, but I've revisited it several times since it's a good reminder of why polish and detail is so important in game dev. To give you a very simple paraphrase version though, juice is a description of how good your game feels to play. This doesn't factor in game mechanics or game loops, but rather just things that make the game feel good to interact with. There's a lot of additions that can be made to make a game juicier, but aside from making the game look nicer, I've tried adding some juicier elements through post-processing. I set this up using Unity's inbuilt post-processing through the URP, and got to work setting up a generic system that let me access the post-processing through any script in the game. To make this work, I pre-selected which post-processing options I wanted, in this case vignette, lens warping, chromatic aberration, and film grain. I also threw in camera shake into the system, even though it doesn't belong, so we'll be talking about that too. Essentially, through the main manager object for each level instance, I've got a post-processing controller, which can run various post-processing events I've created either by lerping a value or by running a coroutine. These are pre-built events made as scriptable objects and saved in the manager as a library, and external scripts can call these events by using their internal ID names. So for example, as the energy bar reduces, chromatic aberration increases, the vignette darkens, and the film grain grows. This is all to aid in that feeling of being near to death, so the player isn't necessarily focusing on the energy bar constantly. Another place I've implemented it is through the slowdown feature, which I'm sure you've forgotten about because I forget about it too sometimes. Don't worry, I've thought of plenty of ways to make it more relevant, but for now it's worth showing it's a lot more obvious when the player enters slow motion, that warping giving a sense that their perception is something outside of their standard view. The last piece of these additions, and arguably the most juicy, is the screen shake, which fires off every time a gun is shot, and helps to add an impact that was previously missing. Again, screen shake is not post-processing, but I've lumped it into the system since it's a thing that multiple scripts will likely use in the future. Altogether, that counts towards another code addition. So all up, art additions win out, which isn't a huge surprise all things considered, but having that variety in implementation seriously helped me focus on each task I gave myself as it came. What are your thoughts? Do you think I could have approached any of these tasks differently? I'm personally very happy with how it ended up, but I'm interested to hear what other people think. Now, this is already a longer devlog than usual, so I'm hesitant to extend this any longer than it needs to be, but I'm sure some of you are wondering about my thoughts on the situation with Unity and if that'll affect the development of Project Concordia. I think where it's at right now, it would be too much of a task to try porting this game over to another engine, and I frankly don't have the time to start learning a new engine on top of everything I'm already doing. So the short answer is no, the new revenue sharing rules will not affect the production of Project Concordia, but it might affect the production of the next game. It'll entirely depend on how the situation pans out. With that out of the way, we've come to the end of another devlog. Thanks to everyone who stuck it out till the end, I appreciate you watching, and if you already made it this far, why don't you scroll down a little and hit that subscribe button? Maybe leave a like, maybe comment and tell me you made it to the end. Whatever feels right.